help me understand how this works. So say I'm a member of the minority party and there's something coming down the pipeline, some piece of legislation, and I don't have the votes that I need. So I'm considering filibustering. And set aside where I know we're going to go in terms of this sort of strategic aspect of this. Let's say I actually am intent to filibuster. How does this work?
Right. So if you are, say, Senator Ted Cruz, and you're in the minority party in the Senate right now, and there's a bill that's going to come up, you think it might come up for a vote, and you don't like the bill, you could threaten to filibuster. You could make your intent known that I'm going to, every senator has an inherent right to recognition in the Senate, which is not the same, it doesn't exist in the House. So you can be recognized by the presiding officer, and you can just talk for as long as you can possibly talk.
Now, so I just get up and just start talking about anything.
Yeah, because there's no germaneness requirement, which is to say that it doesn't have to be about the bill even, and that's how you get people reading from the phone book or from recipe books or from Dr. Seuss, anything to consume time. Now, what you would want to consider is how many other senators, how many of your colleagues are with you in opposition to this bill. And you're going to need 40 people who want you to keep reading from the phone book or reading Green Eggs and Ham. And the reason for that number is because the majority can make a motion to invoke cloture on you. So cloture, this is the procedure to limit debate in the Senate. And currently, you need 60 votes to do that. And so if people were tired of you talking and wanted to move on to actually voting on the bill, they could make a motion to invoke cloture. If they got 60 affirmative votes on that motion, it would limit debate. So you wouldn't have to stop immediately, but it would say you have one more hour, for example. So that's how that would work. But if you were alone in opposing this bill, it's very easy to invoke cloture on you. If 99 other senators want you to stop talking, they can very easily do that.
So where does this, without going, I know we could probably spend the whole time on just the kind of historical side of this, but in a nutshell, where does this come from?
So I would refer to it, and others have referred to it as essentially a parliamentary accident. This is one of the misconceptions that I like clearing up, and the people from my class will know this, is that the filibuster is not in the Constitution. If you were to pull up a PDF of the Constitution and Control F search filibuster, you wouldn't find anything. In 1806, Aaron Burr, who was Thomas Jefferson's vice president at that time, wanted to sort of clean up the Senate rule book and made a motion to get rid of a couple rules. One of those rules was the previous question motion. And the previous question motion was allowed by a simple majority to end debate and move on to a vote on the bill. They got rid of this motion in 1806, not because they wanted to create what we call the talking filibuster. That was actually not intended at all, and it wasn't until from 1806 to 1917 there was basically no way that that you could end debate in the Senate. 1917 was the first time the Senate came up with a cloture rule. This was leading up to the U.S.'s entrance into World War I. Woodrow Wilson was the president at the time, and he said something like, the U.S. Senate is the only legislative body in the world that can't act when a majority in the Senate is ready to act. And so what you have is a group of willful and obstinate men who are representing no one's interest or preference but their own, who are preventing us from taking action to, for example, arm merchant ships or send the army to get involved in World War I. And so he said, we have to come up with a way to end debates in the Senate, and that's when they came up with this cloture motion, which at that time was a 2/3 threshold. So you needed 2/3 of the members of the Senate to vote to invoke cloture and end a filibuster. In 1975, that got revised down to 3/5, which is what it currently is, and that's why 60 votes is the magic number there. So it's basically a parliamentary accident that comes about because senators have the right to be recognized in the Senate, and there's no procedure by which a majority can prevent a senator from debating for as long as they want on anything that they want.
So you and I, one of the things that we talked about was that, like in practice, for all of the attention that this gets, in practice, this doesn't actually happen that often. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you'll hear, and you have heard recently about bills that have been killed by the filibuster in the U.S. Senate. So 2, for example, voting rights bills that most Democrats wanted to bring up in the Senate, they weren't able to bring up, and it's announced in the media that these bills were killed by the filibuster. But we didn't see anybody filibuster those bills. In fact, nobody did, right? We would have seen coverage of this if it had happened. Sort of like most good, credible threats, the filibuster doesn't actually have to be used to be effective. And so the way that things work in the modern Senate is the first thing you do when you're thinking about debating a bill is try to invoke cloture. And so that's what they did. They don't go ahead with the debate. They say, okay, because someone has told me they might want to filibuster this bill, let's just try to get the cloture motion out of the way. And so they'll make a motion to invoke cloture.
So the majority, presumably the majority party would do this just as like a backstop.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah. And so think about the Democrats trying to bring a voting rights bill to the floor that the minority party, the Republicans, would rather not have on the floor. The Democrats have the option to say, okay, fine, filibuster it, we'll wait you out, and then when you're done, we'll vote on the bill. They don't do that. They say, let's try to invoke cloture right now, and when that cloture vote fails, which you know in advance that it will, we can say, oh, well, this would have been filibustered, and so Republicans are preventing us from bringing this to the floor. And so you actually rarely see, so as I have up here, technically the definition of a filibuster is just any dilatory action in a legislature. So anything that's purpose is to delay legislative action or to try to prevent legislative action. What we think of usually when we say filibuster, though, is this talking filibuster. And this is what we're saying, there are famous instances of it. And, there's a movie poster right outside here in which I think Jimmy Stewart is in a movie where he filibusters in the U.S. Senate. And so that's what draws people's attention. But this is rarely actually ever happening. And it hasn't happened in these recent instances that we're talking about. And that's because if there are 50 Republican senators who want to filibuster, the longest single senator filibuster ever was Strom Thurmond against the Civil Rights Bill in the late 1950s. He filibustered by himself for 24 hours. Let's say that each of the 50 senators could do that. We waste 50 legislative days. I mean, maybe not waste, right? That's the value judgment. But the majority's not willing to do that at this point. If there's anything else they want to get done, those other bills are going to be essentially held hostage in a situation where we get into a filibuster that has no end in sight. And so rather than going all the way down that game tree, they just say, let's see if we can nip it in the bud right now by invoking cloture. Oh, we can't. Okay, well, we're not going to deal with that bill.
So, and this will be a point where we can kind of open it up to everyone else. But you and I started to talk about some of the things maybe people don't think about if they think about the possibility of this going away or if it being altered in some way. I mean, presumably there's other ways to alter this process by changing the number of votes needed for cloture. But what are some of the potential unintended consequences or things we haven't think about. Because I think that most people, when they hear about filibuster, there's kind of this innate sense of like when we were kids and you're playing a game with your friends and the one team's losing, and instead of just continuing to try and do harder, they take the ball and just engage in a game of keep away, right? We're not going to play anymore, and we're just going to keep the ball away from you because we're losing and we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And I think there's kind of this intuitive sense that that's what it feels like, and that intuitive sense might lead people to be like, I don't understand why this thing is still there. It seems ridiculous. We should do away with it. And certainly that opinion gets stronger at any given point in time in the majority party if they're frustrated with the minority. So, but what kind of things potentially, strategically or otherwise, maybe change if this accident isn't there anymore?
Right. So it is the case that a majority in the Senate at any given time could get rid of the filibuster entirely, could, change the rules to lower the threshold needed for cloture, and that's happened before. The typical explanation for why that hasn't happened is this idea of reciprocity and sort of the shadow of the future, which is to say that if you're in the majority right now, you might be very frustrated by the minority party preventing you from achieving some legislative goal. But 2 years from now, your party might be in the minority. And then you're going to be thankful that the filibuster exists because you can stop the majority from doing these things with which you disagree. And so it usually does, I think that, voters, to the extent that voters are aware of the filibuster, their preferences about the filibuster are just tied to their partisan affiliation. So Democrats right now are frustrated with the filibuster because they blame it for, the reason we can't get new voting rights legislation, a couple other things, right? And Republicans then are going to be much more likely to say, well, no, the filibuster is a good thing. It protects minority rights. And so, all this tradition that it's been around, although by accident, since 1806, to change it now would be kind of rash, right? I think that the fears that for example, if you talk to a Democrat right now who says, let's keep the filibuster even though we really want these policy achievements, they're going to say, well, can you imagine what a unified Republican government is going to do once we get rid of the filibuster, once we're in the minority? To the extent that I'm making any kind of argument today, one speculative argument that I would make is that fear is overblown, and I'm going to advance through some slides here to talk about why that is. So when I think about the filibuster and a lot of legislative procedures that either make it easy or difficult for the majority party to implement its platform, I think about it in this theoretical framework called responsible party government. And you can see here in my title, it's possible that right now we're under irresponsible party government. But the responsible party government model really boiled down to a pretty simplistic set of steps, is that parties develop their platforms, they tell the public what they want to do. The public, the electorate, votes based on those platforms. They install one party, we'll call it Party X. Party X wins, and then in step 4, Party X implements their platform, and the voters observe the outcomes, they decide whether or not they like that, and then they vote again. The parties have a chance to revise their platforms, but then parties are held responsible for what they say they want to do because they actually can do what they say they want to do, right? That's how responsible party government should work. I would argue that with legislative procedures and institutions like the filibuster, this is the way it works. So right now we have unified democratic government. Does that mean that we get the democratic platform? It kind of remains to be seen, but we're probably not going to get it, right? The Democrats are not going to be able to do what they said they were going to do. So with step 4, you have unified government. What do you get from that? Who knows? Whose fault is it that we didn't get what the party promised us? Kind of unclear, right? My argument is that getting rid of the filibuster is going to affect not just step 4, it's going to affect step 1 as well. I think parties will actually come up with different platforms if they know that those platforms can actually be implemented and they no longer have the filibuster as an excuse, right? So I think right now, the reason why you don't see Democrats implementing their policy preferences in the Senate is not because the filibuster exists. It's because they don't actually agree on what those policies should be. You can see that, even using reconciliation, which is, we could have another whole talk on what reconciliation is, but reconciliation allows Senate majorities under certain conditions to pass bills with a simple majority. Democrats are having difficulty doing anything through that, just like Republicans did not that long ago when they had unified government. They did not repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and it wasn't the filibusters' fault that they didn't. They just didn't have 51 votes to do it, to say nothing of 60, right? And so the majority allows, or the filibuster allows the majority party to act big and tough. We're gonna pass all these things. If it wasn't for the minority party, we would definitely be doing this. We would definitely be passing large-scale voting reform. We would definitely be passing the Green New Deal. These are the things we really want to do. Our base gets really excited about them, but we know, here's the whispered part, the secret part, we know we're never going to do these things. So actually, if you get rid of the filibuster, I think majority parties look a bit more like this. They've scaled back their platforms because they know they're playing with live ammo now. They're playing for real, right? And they're going to be held responsible for those platforms once they're implemented. And just to follow up on this, these senators, Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire, Michael Bennet from Colorado, Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada, Raphael Warnock from Georgia, and then I'm forgetting this astronaut Kelly's first name, but from Arizona. These are senators that are not Manchin and Sinema, who are getting the lion's share of the blame for Democratic failures right now. But I'm willing to bet that at least most of these senators are happy that the filibuster exists, because the filibuster allows them to cast messaging votes on liberal priorities. Oh yeah, I would vote for this if only we actually could vote for it on the floor. So they vote, yes, let's invoke cloture. But I don't think that these people actually want to cast votes on polarizing partisan priorities, given the fact that they're going to be up for re-election soon. They barely won their, if you look at some of these, like Hassan from New Hampshire, barely won her previous election to the Senate. This suggests that, these senators are in a tough spot already politically, and they don't want to be put in an even tougher spot. And so I think they're actually pretty happy. You might hear some of them complain about the filibuster. But to me, complaints about the filibuster, get rid of it then, if you're complaining about it, right? You can. You have the votes right now to get rid of the filibuster. But if the optimal play is to keep it in place so that you can blame others for the fact that your party platform isn't implemented, that might be one reason why we have this equilibrium that we have. So that's kind of a long, drawn-out answer to your question.
That's great. All right, let me go ahead and open it up for other people to chime in and ask questions and contribute to the discussion.
So one question. You can't filibuster a vote to get rid of the filibuster?
I was hoping that we wouldn't have to get into this because this is... there's a whole thing about you can make a point of order and then the presiding officer would have to rule on something. So you can make a point of order like, I actually interpret Rule 22, Senate Rule 22, to say you only need 51 votes to invoke cloture. And then the presiding officer would have to make a ruling on that. If the presiding officer agrees with you, they could make a ruling that would support you. That goes into Senate precedent. So it actually doesn't change the rules of the Senate, but it changes precedent, and those are basically have equal weight. So there is a way to get around that. Technically, if you make a motion to change the rules of the Senate, the threshold that you're subject to is even higher than the 2/3 60 vote threshold, or the 3/5 60 vote threshold. It is a 2/3 threshold, but there's a way to get around that, and they call that the nuclear option. Like that's what Democrats under Harry Reid did that in 2013 for lower court nominations. Republicans in 2017 did that for the Supreme Court nominations. And so you've seen kind of targeted instances in which procedurally, parliamentarily, it is possible for majorities to change those, to affect the precedent, basically. But the effect is, yeah, you can change it without being filibustered. Some of those motions are non-debatable, which is how they get around that.
So, I mean, all of that suggests then, just in terms of thinking about the broader kind of likelihood of what we see here, I mean, one way to kind of follow on from your discussion about the strategic utility of these things and the strategic utility of being able to make the appeal that, hey, this is all happening because of filibuster, and you kind of blame that, is that we'll just continue to see this long cycle going from party to party, depending upon who's in the majority, of the majority party complaining about it, threatening to do something about it, and then not actually doing anything about it.
Right.
Is that kind of how you see the likelihood of anything actually changing here, or how, or do you think?
Yeah. So what you would need, I mean, the fact that this has been around for so long is testament to the fact that it is. Presumably, it benefits majorities in the Senate, because if it didn't, they could get rid of it. I think what you would need, and a lot of people at the beginning of this Congress thought, well, this might be the Congress where it goes, because you have unified Democratic government, we're very polarized, and you have policy priorities that Democrats are really serious about, that they really, really want to get done. That's what you would need. You would need a majority that was unified, and I'm suggesting that we don't have that right now, and we haven't had that in a while. And then you need a policy priority that's important enough to everyone in the party, and that everyone agrees on, and that they want it so badly that they're going to get rid of the filibuster. That's like, that's why. So the 2017 example for Republicans in the Senate using a nuclear option so that they can put someone on the Supreme Court with a simple majority. That's an example. The Supreme Court judicial politics really unifies the Republican Party. They had the votes to do that for that specific thing. It was thought in this Congress that voting rights legislation might be the thing that would unify Democrats enough to finally get rid of the filibuster. So far, that hasn't been the case. There have been close calls throughout history, and voting rights is what brought this to mind. So in 1890, we got within one vote of getting rid of the filibuster. And this was on the Lodge election bill. So this is Henry Cabot Lodge. He was a Republican senator from Massachusetts in the 1890s. The era we're in, post-Reconstruction. So the federal troops have been withdrawn from the South for a little over 10 years at this point. The South then has, through various legal and illegal means, sort of made government all white again in the South, and argued that the 15th Amendment doesn't apply to state laws, and essentially repressed African American political activity. Republicans at that time in 1890 were going to pass this voting rights bill that would give the federal government the ability to regulate and run state elections for the U.S. House of Representatives. In some ways kind of similar to the conflict that's going on right now, which is enhanced federal government control over elections. And Republicans almost eliminated the filibuster to do that. There were the opposition to that bill was coming from the South primarily. But even at that time, the Republican Party wasn't unified enough on that goal. Some members of the Republican Party made a deal on a bill about the coinage of silver and bimetallism, and then others were interested in this tariff, and they essentially traded their votes. They said, okay, we won't vote to get rid of the filibuster if some of these Southerners will vote with us on the McKinley tariff, or if some of these other people will vote with us on the silver bill. And so you need, a unifying policy goal and a party that's unified around it. And if you don't have those things, then you don't get rid of the filibuster, I don't think.
With one vote short, I mean, did it effectively just die right there? What's the sort of history immediately afterward? Was there any attempt to think, well, we were close, and so
no,
there's a
I mean,
reason to
you
try it
don't
again,
get
or-
a bill that does anything like the Lodge Bill in 1890 was trying to do until really 1965. I mean, it was a 1957 Civil Rights Act, and that's the one that Strom Thurmond had the longest filibuster on. But he talked for 24 hours, and then 2 hours after he stopped talking, they passed the bill. But it was weak enough because it needed the support of some of these Southern members. But yeah, after they failed to get rid of the filibuster, that Lodge Bill was effectively dead.
what's the substitute tactic? If it were to go away, what other kind of delaying options, or like where do you see the minority party shift to
Yeah.
in terms of good procedural actions or otherwise to try and stall?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that you can do, like you can demand a recorded vote on the journal or something. Like at faculty meetings when we say, we're going to approve the notes or something.
Yeah.
Well, if you're in a body of 100 people and maybe not all of them are there, and like those votes can kind of take a long time.
Yeah.
And they don't have to be recorded roll call votes. I mean, we're not learning anything about the ideology of senators based on how they voted to approve the journal or not. And so there's no reason necessarily that has to be a recorded vote, but you can call for a recorded vote on things like that. You could do what Democrats at the state level in Texas did recently, and you could just leave. So you could run away and go to another state, and there are methods that the Senate has to get you back, but it takes time, right? You can offer amendments. I mean, Senate procedure is so much more open than House procedure is. But at the end of the day, you can vote against the bill and you can lose, but you will have taken something has happened, right? And you will have taken a stand, and your position will be, publicly noted, and then you run on that in the next election. I'm not sure that there's anything absent the filibuster that would allow you to credibly threaten to waste as much time as the filibuster allows you to waste. Mm-hmm.
So you opened by saying that filibuster isn't in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
But my understanding of many of the founders' intents was to create a system of government that put as many opportunities to throw a wrench in the process as they could.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, since most, if not all, of the key founders were still alive in 1806
Mm-hmm.
or 1807, how did they respond to it?
Mm-hmm.
Or if they didn't respond to it, if Madison didn't say, I think this is a great idea,
Right.
how do you think they would?
Yeah.
Would it fit into the architecture that they set up in the Constitution?
Mm-hmm. Well, so at the time, getting rid of the previous question motion was not seen as opening the Pandora's box into allowing filibusters. It wasn't the intent at all. They weren't like, we are upset with the fact that a simple majority can move on to vote on a bill, and so let's get rid of this rule. It was just like, they actually saw that itself as a dilatory tactic. There are so many things that senators can demand a vote on. Let's just get rid of some of those things. And so in some ways it was trying to make majority action more effective. And then it just turned out through an unintended consequence that it allowed for minority obstructionism. Hamilton is one person who has written on this, although it was prior to 1806 and it wasn't specifically about the filibuster, but he was very clearly on record being against any parliamentary procedure that would allow a minority to obstruct the will of the majority. And there are some good Hamilton quotes on that. But I think the founders, just like most of us, their preferences on procedure are just inextricably tied to their preferences on policy. So it would be based on, would this make it possible for me to achieve a policy goal that I have, or would it make it difficult to? And so it would be contingent on what the majorities look like and what the coalitional breakdown is within Congress. The Constitution says that the chambers come up with their own rules, right? There was writing that would suggest that, outside of the Constitution, that would suggest that the Senate is supposed to be a place where it's the saucer that cools the whatever it is that saucers cool, soup or milk or something, and so that it should be a place where things are slowed down, right? But slowing things down is different from just derailing the process entirely, which is effective. You can look at maybe the way, one way of thinking about the filibuster, and proponents of retaining the filibuster will say it forces compromise. Well, that's one thing it could do, it might do. It's an empirical question whether or not that actually happens, and I would suggest that it doesn't. It's a difficult empirical question because maybe the existence of the filibuster affects even just the types of bills that are introduced in the first place. But usually what we don't see is somebody filibusters, people change their mind because of the filibuster, and they're like, oh, okay, well, here's this more moderate bill now that people are going to be on board with, and we'll pass that. If that happened, the filibuster seems like an effective mechanism to induce cooperation and compromise and bipartisanship. I think empirically it's hard to find evidence that happens. I've kind of strayed pretty far from your question about the founders, but I gave you Hamilton, and then I gave you the fact that the others, I think, would, they can make principled arguments that seem to be only about procedure, but I would find it hard to believe that those aren't in some way tied to policy goals and ideological goals that existed at the time.
You mentioned the talking filibuster.
Mm-hmm.
Is there another form of filibuster?
Well, technically, like I had in that definition up there, I mean, the filibuster, because this isn't something that is enshrined in the Constitution or rules or even Senate precedent by the name filibuster. Filibuster actually is just generally referring to any dilatory action. So, forcing votes on things that don't advance legislation, that kind of thing. A disappearing quorum. So you could constantly make quorum calls. You'd be like, I'm not sure that there are enough people here to conduct business. Everybody stand up and say your name if you're here, and then if one person leaves, you're like, I'm gonna make another quorum call just to make sure. Yeah. There are a lot of ways that you can take advantage of parliamentary procedure to waste time. You have to know the procedure, and in that way, kind of your knowledge of the procedure is what allows you to, try to further your goals through these different actions. But so any of those things technically are filibustering.
When you say rare, do you refer to talking filibuster or overall?
Yeah, so talking filibusters are relatively rare. Motions to invoke cloture, which is another way of trying to measure this, are actually becoming much more frequent over time. So which you can then assume means filibusters are being threatened at a higher rate than basically they ever have been. And instead of actually just letting the debate play out and trying to see what happens, majorities are very frequently trying to invoke cloture really before the process starts.
So, yeah, and then, actually, I'm just curious, because to me, there are other strategies to slow or delay the process. Instead of using talking to filibuster, because as an individual, the cost is really high on that person.
Right.
Have to stay there for 20 hours, it's like a lot of logistic support to make it happen. And so, is there any study talking about incentive, why certain person would choose this strategy instead of others? Do they actually get benefit, political benefit by doing that?
Right.
What's the consequence of it? Maybe they get more votes afterwards or more support from their jurisdiction?
Yeah. Well, so a couple points on that. The cost of the filibuster can be distributed over as many people who want to keep it going. So you could, yield the floor for a question to me, and if we're both on the same side, we both want to keep the filibuster going. So it becomes easier than if there are 50 of us who want to keep this going, and if it's just you. If it were just you anyway, we would all invoke cloture on you in a second, and you wouldn't really have the chance to filibuster. But yeah, there are certainly. You mean, who was it? Was it Wendy Davis in Texas who had a filibuster in state government and state legislature? It allows you, it affords you a lot of coverage if you're very passionate about the issue on which you're filibustering, and if you think that your constituents also are. It can help you out as a demonstration of the intensity of your preference in this area. So in some ways it's worth more than a vote against something because of the publicity that you get for that. And so, yeah, I think in equilibrium, like anything that you see a politician doing in Congress, they're doing it because they believe it benefits them electorally. And so we don't sort of randomly assign people to filibuster and then see what happens with them electorally. They'll choose to do it if they feel that it benefits them, I think. Yeah.
Here's a far out argument. I'm really interested in judicial filibustering. Think about it maybe once a day, maybe once a month. What about the argument that filibustering judicial nominees is unconstitutional, violates the appointments clause of Article 2? In that the appointments clause, president appoints, the advice of the Senate confirms, there's no talk of a supermajority at all.
Right.
And so we've gone back and forth on filibustering judicial nominees. We had the Reed model where we had just lower courts, and then but since it doesn't call for a supermajority, I would say that using a supermajority would be unconstitutional.
Interesting. So we talk about that or kind of things like that in my class every once in a while, because I mentioned something about, the filibuster not being in the Constitution or parties not being in the Constitution or something like that. I talk about a lot of things that aren't in the Constitution. I refer to them as extra constitutional, right? But extra constitutional is different from unconstitutional. Your argument presumably is that advice and consent precludes a supermajority requirement, right? And that because the Senate says, or because the Constitution says that the Senate advises on these nominees, right, that you can't have a supermajority threshold. I don't think it's specific enough to read that into it, but ultimately, like, where we would get the answer to that is in the Supreme Court, right? Like, if that ever, I don't think that you could make a motion in the Senate that this was unconstitutional and then through that motion change the Constitution.
I would say that it thwarts the function assigned by the Constitution. That's the argument.
Right. Yeah, that advice and consent is vague, and an interpretation of it that would allow a minority in the Senate to, obstruct a nominee goes against not the direct text of the Constitution, but the intent of the Constitution, maybe. Is that right?
Something like that. I guess it would be like, the president would appoint someone real time, 2021, and be frustrated by the use of the filibuster.
Right.
And say, the Senate is violating separation of powers in thwarting my effort to appoint and get them to advise and consent.
Right.
That's far-fetched, but far-fetched arguments can sometimes catch the interest of justices.
Yeah.
And all you would need would be four.
Right, to hear the case. Yeah. So at this point, though, that's a higher bar than we need to clear. If you think about this in sort of a hierarchy of how difficult it is to change something, the nuclear option changed the Senate procedure. Now you can't filibuster judicial nominations. If that's the case, we don't need to worry about changing the Constitution, unless what we're concerned about is, Senate procedure is going to change again. And so, yeah, I mean, you could try to amend the Constitution to make that more specific, or you could hope that the Supreme Court takes up a case and says, in our interpretation of the Constitution, it's unconstitutional to.
I assume that we will return to it again.
Yeah.
And
So
that's
yeah.
my number one assumption.
See, my thought on that is that Supreme Court justices are going to be really, really, really hesitant to make a ruling that changes the procedure of one of the two chambers of Congress. I would think that they would say that's beyond sort of the purview of what we want to do, especially if it's seen at the time as a partisan issue, which I think inevitably it would be. And I would defer to you on really anything having to do with courts, but that's my thought on. I think justices would rather stay away from that issue.
Yeah, it'd be a political question.
Right.
But I think that, at some point in time, they may grow frustrated with, the Chief Justice of the United States, one of his responsibilities is administrative, and that is to keep the federal courts functioning efficiently. And he lobbies Congress and asks for more money or courthouses or more seats on the federal bench. So there's that role of the Chief Justice.
Right.
But again, I'm kind of writing the novel here. This is more or less kind of a scenario.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me.
Yeah, it's interesting to me as well. I'll keep thinking about it. I'll think about it once a day.
I mean, the Biden commission had this commission that met to recommend changes and reforms. And so one of which was to whether term limits should be imposed on the justices and
Right.
so forth and so on. No agreement on anything really was.
Yeah.
But I think that was one of the issues of whether or not they were thinking that the return of the filibuster or the lack of filibuster was affecting the quality of judicial.
Well, yeah, and I mean, one thing that you could, I was talking about how, like, empirically it's difficult to, so of course it's always going to be difficult to explain or measure the effect of something that is constant. So, like, we don't know necessarily what effect the filibuster is having because we don't have the alternate universe Senate without the filibuster and this parallel universe with, so we can't compare, right? But one thing you could do is look at justices who were nominated while nominations could still be filibustered versus justices who have been nominated after the nuclear option, right? And say, you know, like, is Brett Kavanaugh more ideologically extreme than, you know, justices who were appointed while their nomination could be filibustered? And you would have to take account any kind of time train that may have and did exist during that time. But yeah, it's interesting to think about.
I know that the reconciliation process, you just need a simple majority, right?
Mm-hmm.
So on bills that aren't related to budgetary issues,
Mm-hmm.
once you cross the 60 vote threshold to get past the filibuster,
Mm-hmm.
how many votes do you need to pass the bill itself? Is it 60 as well, or just?
No,
simple
you would
majority?
just need 51.
Okay.
Yeah, simple majority.
Except for instances like impeachment,
Right.
where it's specified in the Constitution.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if we're just talking about a normal bill, yeah, you have to get over that big 60 vote unless you're going through reconciliation. But once you, yeah, so for, you know, that's something that people also say is, you know, can't, like there was a lot of talk about this with the raising of the debt ceiling. Can't you at least find 10 Republicans who are going to vote to invoke cloture, and then when it gets to the floor, they can go ahead and vote against it, and they'll be on record as being against it. If we know enough about parliamentary procedure, we'll know that the only reason it got to the floor is because they voted to invoke cloture, but I don't know how many people are paying that close of attention. But yeah, you can invoke cloture and then pass a bill with a simple majority.
Would you ever see in, you know, playing out the strategy here, you're saying that the reason the Democrats aren't passing what they want to pass isn't the Republicans, it's the Democrats.
Is that they don't want to pass it. It's, well, I mean, that's too negative towards the Democrats. That not all of them agree that they really want to pass it.
I mean, I'm just trying to think, why hasn't Mitch McConnell thought this through and said, let's let these bills get passed, and then they can't blame us anymore.
Right.
Then it really is about Joe Manchin and Chris.
Yeah,
Stevens,
yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah, in
why
other words,
hasn't
he's like, you know, make these people, well, I'm referencing nothing, but
Yeah.
they were up there, right? Make these vulnerable senators take the vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is just what you're weighing there is something that you presumably really don't like becoming law, which is what the cost would be to McConnell of doing that, versus the benefit, which is you would have to weight by some probability, right? You hope, if you're McConnell, forcing these people to take this tough vote, either they're not going to take it and the bill will fail, and that would look terrible for Democrats. That would be the best possible outcome for McConnell. It's like some people took risky votes, but it failed by one vote. Maybe now those people will lose, and this didn't become law. But the worst case scenario would be, you know, it actually did become law, and my political calculus was wrong. Like, it turned out, you know, the constituents in Nevada actually liked that Cortez Masto cast this vote, and so, you know, I think there's just much more uncertainty with that strategy than exists with the current strategy.
Yeah, and you wonder how much of it is like sort of the active versus passive calculus. You know, that well, you know, yeah, we have to weigh the probability that maybe that doesn't happen. This at least is us engaging actively in opposition, even if it's just a delaying tactic opposition, versus what might be perceived, maybe even implicitly, as a more passive strategy where they're just going to wait and try and see if the Democrats implode, given their own differences inside the party.
Right.
Yeah, cool.
So we've seen, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I think we can back it up. We've seen a considerable amount of institutional decay with basic core democratic institutions over the past 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that a simple majority through some maneuvers can change almost any rule in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
So what's this, if people who are currently senators right now, who have been either condoned or actively supported institutional decay and the breakdown of rule of law or separation of powers, what's to stop them in 2 years or 4 years from just going in and completely railroading the rules that exist in the Senate and basically gutting it as an institution to facilitate, say, predominant executive branch.
Right. I mean, part of that you just have to hope that to take it back to the founders and the Federalist Papers, like ambition has to be made to counteract ambition, right? And the interests of the person has to be tied to sort of the power of the place or whatever it was, right? Which is to say, you hope that senators, as senators, care about the Senate as an institution. I realize there's maybe reason to believe that, or reason to question that, right? But if the type of rules changes that you're worried about are like the Senate abolishing itself or something, or the Senate basically turning itself into a rubber stamp for the executive branch, the fact that we are in this era of insecure majorities where majority party control of government is switching back and forth very frequently is, I think, one thing that keeps that from happening, right? There's some, you would hope that there's some like built-in incentive to retain the separation of powers and the strength of Congress as an institution. The argument that's being made sometimes is that partisanship is overriding everything, basically. But I think even if that's true, you want to maintain the legislative branch as a bulwark against the executive branch because divided government happens all the time, and because it's very easy to anticipate that it will continue to happen, you know? So rather than having the Senate be just a wholly owned subsidiary of the presidency during unified government, which is what the concern would be, I guess, because you know that government's not always going to be unified, you might be hesitant to do that. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, my concern is you just have to do it once, right? Because if you go down that road, the idea of letting anybody else have power again is, you just repress them. Right? So the idea is that once you let a dictator come to power, you don't have to worry about democracy after that, right? And so the idea is that once you've gone down that road, you make the change, and then that sets it.
Right. Yeah. Because my answer does rely on the reciprocity and repeat games and all that. It's like, well, you could end the game at this turn, and you don't have to worry. Yeah. I mean, that is scary and depressing, and I wish that I had some answer that would, just disabuse you of all those doubts and fears, but I don't. My bet is that it won't happen, and that has been the safe bet for a long time. But you're right; you only have to be wrong once.